It was supposed to be the last time our boys and the rest of mankind would have to experience full-scale destruction. The millions who had died by the end of World War I, November 11th, 1918, were to have been the sacrifices for lasting peace. It was in Paris on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month that the Western world began the tradition of marking the end of the war to end all wars. Our doughboys who fought it called it the Great War, and the French, La Grande Guerre. Although our vision of world peace has been blurred and the name Armistice Day broadened to include all veterans, that tradition of the 11th day is upheld every year. In Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, the World War I Drum and Bugle Corps has marched proudly down Ashman Street on November 11th. And when the old legs couldn't quite make it anymore, they got a little help from a trailer and rolled out the old tunes. It was in the 1930s that the American Legionnaires from the Sioux formed a Drum and Bugle Corps. It was a good-sized group that began practicing and playing out of the American Legion Post number 3 in the Sioux. But as time passed, their numbers shrank, and for a while the Corps quit rehearsing and even meeting. But the instruments were finally brought out of the closet. The World War I uniforms brushed off, and Mademoiselle from Armentières was heard again on Asham Street when the 11th month and day rolled around. Time still took its toll on the Corps, and the folks in the Sioux knew that their war heroes weren't immortal. As the 60th anniversary of the end of the Great War approached in 1978, a veteran of World War II named George Rohr realized that the Sioux Corps had, through its travels, brought honor and distinction to the city. He felt it was time for the Sioux to repay the debt, time to send the boys back over there for the anniversary. George and a committee in the Sioux raised money in Michigan and eventually much of the United States and Canada. The Detroit Free Press helped, and then Jerry Halloran, a Detroit travel expert, put all the arrangements together, from British Airways to bus to hovercraft. But let's not hop across the Atlantic too quickly. It should be noted that only 18 members of the World War I Drum and Bugle Corps were left when $35,000 was raised for the historic trip. By D-Day, 11 could make the 11th hour return, some with wives. When they arrived in Detroit, they were accompanied by Paul Stoling and Phil Clear, 2 National Guardsmen who helped with the logistics, and the Corps' physician, Donald Howe, and his wife, Margaret. Also along, paying their way, were Bob Matson, Corps bus driver for many years, and his daughter, Nancy. Bill Raby, Public Relations Director from Lake Superior State College, and his wife, Ann, rounded out the contingent from the Sioux. In Detroit, the Sioux group joined other veterans who paid their own way back over there. Also in Detroit, there was a flag presentation ceremony at the Pontchartrain Hotel, where they were guests. Like all GIs headed overseas, they dined in style at the Pontchartrain wine cellars, saw the musical Showboat at Music Hall, and told newspaper and television reporters how they felt about the trip. On Sunday at St. Peter and Paul Church, they prayed and played. Joined on the steps by Mrs. Joseph A. Gillis, Sr., herself a veteran nurse of World War I. Then off to London and France, to memorable spots they hadn't seen for 60 years. Lafayette, we are here again. Upon arrival in London, a message awaited the Corps. A cordial welcome and best wishes for a pleasant visit from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. In London, the old warriors found a little bit of Michigan waiting. The people from Kellogg, whose home is Battle Creek, hosted a champagne breakfast on board another war veteran, the HMS Belfast, now a tourist attraction moored in the Thames River near the Tower Bridge. It was the site of a breakfast that was a far cry from field rations. The host from Kellogg poured champagne while London reporters and a half-dozen members of Britain's own World War I expeditionary force, the Old Contemptibles, were on board to greet the Michigan vets.
I think it's a great thing that any time the damn Yankees and the limey bastards can get together.
Although all the Sioux crew enjoyed the breakfast, it was especially welcomed by Sammy Mirabelli. This colorful drummer, whose solos gave the Corps time to catch its breath, knows all the famous military drum pieces. But he said he would only make the trip if he were guaranteed an ample supply of Kellogg's All Bran. So the cereal people obliged. While others dined on kippers, scrambled eggs and sausage, Sammy dived into his own tradition, All Bran and beer. That first big day set the stage for the rest of the trip, a busy schedule. The Americans wound through London's streets to their next stop, the Royal Military Hospital at Chelsea. Here, elderly soldiers live as guests of Her Majesty. While the Corps presented a concert for the British veterans, other members of the tour group had an opportunity to wander about the hospital grounds. In the center court of this home for 417 pensioners is a statue of King Charles II as a Roman emperor. It was Charles who in 1683 commanded Sir Christopher Wren, then busy building St. Paul's, to design this building for the veterans. Chelsea Hospital is rich in history, some of it surprisingly close to home for the Michiganians. In this dining hall are dozens of flags captured around the world. The description under 2 flags startled the Americans from Michigan. Captured at Fort Detroit, 1812. The World War I Drum and Bugle Corps commander, Moose Lacombe, shared some refreshments with Sergeant Walter Poole, a man with whom Moose had earlier shared the Great War. Sergeant Poole, formerly of the King's own 15th Royal Hussars, is now 83. Back in 1914, when he was 19, he helped prove that saber-waving cavalrymen don't do well against machine guns.
We made contact with the advance patrols of the German army, which was Uhlans. And we made contact with them at daybreak of the morning, the 22nd. And first we didn't know who they were until daylight got a bit clearer and we could see that they were German cavalry. And we reported back, and up come advance troop and took up position, and we saw the Uhlans away about 200 yards, 200 to 300 yards away to our front, which we opened fire, and that was the first shot fired.
After the Corps gave its concert, there was plenty of time for more reminiscing and booming steins. That first day in London, the Sioux boys, ages 79 to 86, spent 12 hours visiting, touring, and playing. But next morning, they were up with the sun for a tougher but equally enjoyable day. First, a trip to Dowey School at Upper Wolverhampton. A concert by the Corps meant a morning break from the tough curriculum. But the boys knew the words to some of the songs, including Mademoiselle from Armistice. They sing it on the bus returning from sports events. The boys saluted the corps with their own school song, and then Headmaster Wilford Solid gave the visitors a tour through the school. It was founded by Benedictine monks who came to England from France during the bloody French Revolution. Although the school chapel is only 50 years old, it houses one of the few treasures the monks brought from France. A painting by Michelangelo's teacher, dated 1493. Nobody had to paint the Americans a picture of a pub for them to know where to go for lunch. The troops marched to the Crown and Horns, a friendly spot in the tiny town of East Islay, not far from the school. There, the Yanks got a whiff of some cooking close to their home and hearts. The pub featured a Cornish pastry that was an English version of the Upper Peninsula pasty, the meat and vegetable-filled pastries the Michigan copper miners would heat on their shovels over an open fire. After the royal meal, royal treatment for the Drum and Bugle Corps. Especially for them, the present Duke of Marlborough reopened his home, Blenheim Palace, built at the end of the 17th century by the first Duke. In the old days of splendor, the Marlborough family and friends filled the room for visits, ceremonies, and lavish balls. Today, most of the house is a museum, while the family lives in a portion of one wing. Nearby is the village of Bladen with its tiny churchyard. Here lies an historic giant from the distinguished Marlborough family, Sir Winston Churchill. Born in that great house, Churchill shares the modest resting place with the rest of his family. Compared to the monuments over the graves of other great leaders, Churchill seems unbelievably simple. That final evening in London, the Corps and members of the tour were guests of the Worcester Park Legion Post. Following a concert by the Corps, the Americans were accorded membership in the Royal British Legion and were presented this handsome pen, a fitting climax to their visit to England. Merry England was just that, and there was a real sense of regret as the Sioux Corps boarded its coach to Dover, where they would hop a hovercraft to France, closer to the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Captain Catling and the crew, welcome aboard the hovercraft Princess Anne. Channel weather conditions this morning are good, and our crossing time to France will be approximately 35 minutes.
France, D-Day, H-hour. A 35-minute ride across the English Channel was a real experience. Most of the Corps had never been in an airplane before their flight from Michigan. Sam Mirabelli's arthritic hip was acting up, and he needed help to reach the French soil. They hadn't even stepped off the craft when cameras started clicking. NBC television and the Associated Press were there. The next day's headlines, Lafayette, we are here again. In French, of course. On to Armistice. On their way to Paris, the Corps had expected a simple ceremony at Armistice. They were stunned when the people poured out of the bars and offices for their concert and ceremonies in the town square. One French, a British, and 3 American TV crews knew the return of the Sault Ste. Marie World War I Drum and Bugle Corps was just not any old trip across the ocean. So did the Associated Press, United Press International, and a dozen major newspapers. The bandsmen broke out their instruments, and the color bearers, the stars and stripes, to join the battle flags of French regiments long retired from active duty. What else but Mademoiselle from Armistice? Written by a Canadian, Doughboys started singing it during the Great World War, and ever since, the world has joined in. But the old girl never sounded so good. the Armistice Square, the melancholy strains of taps accompanied the darkness and fog that slipped in and provided the patriotic backdrop as Moose and Deputy Mayor Yves Plotkin presented a wreath in honor of the town's unknown soldiers. A feast followed in the town hall, where an invitation was extended to the Sioux boys to make a return trip for the dedication of the new statue of Mademoiselle from Armistice. With more friendships under their belts, the troops moved on to Paris. The next day, a beautiful autumn morning. Back into the trusty coach which had already served the Sioux soldiers for so many miles since London. British coach driver Brian King was amazed by the stamina of his World War I travelers. After 4 days with the 80-year-old crew, the 37-year-old Londoner found himself yawning off to bed, while the veterans called him a rookie and sauntered off to the bar for a nightcap. But Brian was no stick in the mud. Besides running the show from behind the wheel, he sang, told stories, and joked. Even recited a poem he wrote about the Drum and Bugle Corps. All of those who met the men of the world's last World War I Drum and Bugle Corps were touched, moved by their warmth, by what they stood for, and by their pure enjoyment of the whole happening. No one could do enough for them. Gates closed to others were open to the men of La Grande Guerre. They even had a private glide down the River Seine, through the heart of Paris, thanks to the owners of the Bateau Mouche tour boat. In this emotional city, saturated with nostalgia, the veterans cruised through their own time machine, talking of other days and other times.
Our insignia was the red arrow. That meant that we pierced every line that we approached. And we were known as the shock troops of the United States.
The French calls us less terribles.
Yeah, as the shock troops of the United States Army.
We're among the first in Brussels, in Belgium. Well, he said, I guess we'll pitch our pup tents in. So we set up our field kitchen, pitched all our pup tents on the cobblestone pavement. And about that time, this MP captain walked over and he told our captain, he said, Captain, you better call your company to attention. Here comes the king and the queen and the prince and the princess. That's the old palace up there. And these 4 persons were walking down towards us. King Albert was a handsome man, and his queen was just as beautiful. They came down and shook hands with the captain, welcomed us to Belgium, and said, I didn't know you were coming, or I'd had facilities for you. But anyway, he said, I would like to meet your company. So the captain opened ranks, and the king and the queen went down and shook hands with all of us. And then the prince came along, and incidentally, he was the Prince of Brabant. We call ourselves Brabant, but they call it Brabant over there. So the prince came along and shook hands with all of us. And then this little Princess Marie Jones, I've often wondered what become of her. She later married an Italian prince. But she came along. She was about 4 feet high, I guess, and about 3.5 feet wide. But she handed each of us a little card. And the card said, Princess Marie Jones requests your presence at tea at 2:30 in the afternoon. Well, we never got over to the next day to see it, to attend the tea party, but I still have my little card with Princess Marie Jones.
I was in the infantry. That's the...
and we walked every place we went.
I see.
Did we?
I walked across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and
Right up the
the
True
furthest advanced troops in Germany. I walked it with 90-pound pack on your back.
I did too.
Then you also know Hook Nose. What the devil was his name? From Detroit. He was later on Commissioner of Parks.
General Heckel.
Heckel, Colonel Heckel, Hook Nose.
Well, he was a general. He got to be a general.
We had Alsace Lorraine, which was a kind of a quiet sector to be in, and they didn't know that the Americans had exchanged with the French. And when the Americans opened up,
It was hell to pay for the Germans there. Then we were at Chateau Thierry. We crossed the Marne at Chateau Thierry and went into the other side with the Marines. That's the time that everything available was gotten into the push on the Chateau Thierry front.
It was a terrible experience. I wouldn't sell it for $1 million if somebody offered it for my experience. And I don't wish anyone that would ever go through it again.
Thank you, God, for keeping us alive.
As Friday drew to a close, here's how NBC TV News reported the saga of the Corps to millions of viewers back home.
The First World War, called the War to End All Wars, ended 60 years ago tomorrow on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. 4,700,000 Americans served in that war, doughboys. Not many are left these days, but we do have the Sault Ste. Marie Drum and Bugle Corps. They've been playing at Armistice Day celebrations for 6 decades, and this year they decided to go back to France. John Palmer has spent some time with these happy veterans, and here is his report.
The doughboys of World War I are back. At least 11 of them on a tour of England and France, where they fought with General Pershing and the American Army 60 years ago. The oldest is 87, the youngest 79. They boarded a hovercraft in England for the trip across the Channel and their first glimpse of France since 1918. Several of the veterans needed a little help down the gangway. They are being accompanied by a doctor, a nurse, and 2 Michigan National Guardsmen. Thus far, there have been no health problems. Money for the trip came from holding spaghetti dinners and other fundraisers back in Michigan. At Armistice in northern France, they put on a brief concert in the town square, which was decorated with American and French flags. Their first number was, of course, the Mademoiselle from Armistice, one of the most famous songs of World War I, about a French barmaid who refused the affections of a visiting soldier. On hand for the occasion were several French veterans of the First World War. The assistant mayor of the town accepted an American flag from the group and said next year a statue of the Mademoiselle from Armistice would be erected in the town square in memory of the barmaid who had so well defended her honor 60 years ago. Inside City Hall, there were more speeches and, of course, lots of champagne. The veterans wore their soup plate helmets and choke collars. As one of them admitted, these were not their original uniforms. Those had been eaten away by moths many years ago. These uniforms came from Hollywood, left over from a movie about World War I.
It's a thrill of a lifetime, sir. The thrill of a lifetime. Never realized that it would be this way. This is great.
Then there were birthday kisses for 87-year-old Frank Miller, the oldest member of the Drum and Bugle Corps, who was born on November 11th. This afternoon, the veterans boarded a sightseeing boat in Paris for a trip down the Seine.
The members of the Sault Ste. Marie Drum and Bugle Corps are too old to march anymore, but tomorrow morning they'll be here on the Champs-Élysées in the reviewing stand to watch a parade commemorating the day the guns fell silent 60 years ago, ending the First World War. John Palmer, NBC News, Paris.
That's it for this Friday. John Hart will be here tomorrow. Have a nice weekend, everybody, and good night from NBC News.
Finally, the 11th day of the 11th month, Armistice Day, and a high-ranking surprise arranged by Monsieur Yves Coffin, the French Consul General in Detroit. An official government guide delivered each veteran and his wife 2 small white cards with blue stripes. They began with the message: "The President of the Republic of France requests the honor of your presence." The Sioux vets were to be the guest of President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, for memorial services in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and later on his reviewing stand for the parade. And their seats had class, right at the head of the veterans group, which included the French, and right behind all those chaps in dark suits, ambassadors from more than 100 countries. After the ceremony and a short visit with U.S. Ambassador Arthur Hartman, Paris picked up the tempo. The Limey bus joined a caravan of French veterans for a high-speed, police-escorted ride through the city to the Arc de Triomphe. In the very early hours of the same 11th day of the 11th month, the World War I Drum and Bugle Corps had stood under the arch, side by side with two French military honor guards. They saluted the unknown soldier resting beneath the eternal flame. That ceremony was also a fitting salute to the previous night, when they were guest of honor at the American Legion Post number 1, just a short walk down the Champs-Élysées. The spotlight was now on French President d'Estaing, who laid his wreath at the flame.
The President of France and a small group are now walking sedately, slowly across the sidewalk of the street pavement of the Étoile, advancing to the Arc de Triomphe. Slowly, sedately, carrying a huge bouquet of roses, a young lady in uniform. The music has stopped. It's quiet here in the reviewing stand with the Sault Ste Marie veterans of World War I, the World War I Drum and Bugle Corps. The group has now reached the tomb of the unknown soldier. The President of France places the flowers on the tomb, steps back, faces the tomb. An aide is walking up to the President with a velvet tray on which he has medals. And from the right of the Place de the Champs-Élysées, a line of about 15 elderly men, veterans, preceding, stiff formation, erect, into the Étoile. They will come along in front of the President. These are veterans who have won honors and distinction in the past. They will be redecorated with their previous awards by the President in this very moving ceremony. There's nothing like this ceremony in the United States on Armistice Day. One remembers the thin line of the World War I Drum and Bugle Corps down Ashman. And here, a whole city, yes, a nation, turns out to honor their noble dead.
Official ceremonies ended at Place Clemenceau for the Armistice Day Parade, with the Michigan delegation on the reviewing stand. Once again, guests of the French President. cavalry and paratroopers participated, but perhaps the hit of the parade was the French Foreign Legion. Listen as Bill Raby describes.
The bands that we have been hearing previously have been arrayed in front of the reviewing stand or across the street from the reviewing stand, which the World War I Drum and Bugle Corps is sharing with the President of France. Now, a band is marching along the street, approaching us. The band of the famous French Foreign Legion with their white keepies, their white leggings, white garrison belts, colorful red scarves around their throat. The number. This is pretty much of a French equivalent of a drum and bugle corps. The Legionnaires and their band are followed by the troops of the Legion. Commanding officer, his fingers stiff and erect in his leather gloves, his combat boots, his keepee, medals on his chest, followed by the honor guard and white gauntlets. The white keepees, of course, looks like there are about 12 honor battle streamers on their colors. And now the men of the Foreign Legion, white keepees, red brushes on their shoulders, colorful fourragères looped over their right shoulder, many of them wearing medals, marching slowly to the tune and the time of the music that you can hear.
The President not only made a speech and reviewed the troops, but Giscard of France had the chance to shake hands with Moose of the Sioux. United Press International's photographer, Gilles Lemau, performed the introduction and took this picture. Here is what America saw on NBC television that night.
Finally, it was 60 years ago today that the war to end all wars was over. World War I stopping at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And it was called Armistice Day until it became clear that wars were not over. So we changed the name to honor the veterans of the three big wars since. Today, some doughboys who survived World War I went back over there. For that, here's John Palmer.
Red, white, and blue searchlights illuminated the Arc de Triomphe at midnight as Paris began celebrating the 60th anniversary of the end of the Great War. A few blocks away at American Legion Post number 1, members of the Drum and Bugle Corps from Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, were guests of honor at a party. For most of them, it was their first trip back to France since they helped beat the Kaiser in 1918. The 82-year-old leader of the Drum Corps proposed a toast to a friend back in Michigan who helped raise the money so they could return to France.
I would like to drink a toast to the man who started this event to send us to Paris, France, George Rohr of Sault Ste. Marie. God love him.
The American veterans, ranging in age from 79 to 87, spent more than an hour playing the songs they remembered from 60 years ago. The party ended well past midnight with dancing. This morning at 11 o'clock, the exact hour when the guns fell silent 60 years ago, French President Giscard d'Estaing walked up the Champs-Élysées to place a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier. Then there was a parade marking the end of the war on November 11th, 1918, a war that cost 15 million lives and established the United States as a world power. In the official reviewing stand today, as guests of the President of France, were 11 American doughboys, members of the Drum and Bugle Corps from Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan.
For those who served in the First World War, Armistice Day is always a special occasion. And for the 11 members of the Sault Ste. Marie Drum and Bugle Corps who came back to France 60 years later, today was a time of very special memories. John Palmer, NBC News, Paris.
And that's it for this evening. Jessica Savage is here tomorrow night. I'm John Hart. For NBC News, thanks. Good night.
The next day, Sunday the 12th, was the Americans' final one in France. Monday, they would make the 10-hour bus ride, their final one with Brian King, back to London, and then fly home. After the excitement of the 11th hour, everyone had expected this Sunday to be anticlimactic, but it turned out to be the most emotional day of the trip. A day set aside to visit the battlefields and cemeteries of the Great War. On the way to the battlefields, Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood, they stopped at a village for provisions. Everyone loaded up on bread, cheese, wine, and pastries, and probably put a dent in the town's food supply. Herbert Englehart, a history buff from California, verbally took the men back to their battlefield as the bus approached Belleau Woods.
We're actually going to go back toward Paris. We're going to turn right. We're going to enter Belleau Wood from the south end, which is essentially what the troops had to do when they cleared the wood. They began, incidentally, about the 30th of May. It took them 21 days. I honestly can't tell you how many men were lost. I really don't know.
About half of the vets on the tour fought on or near these battlefields. 3 were wounded within a few miles of this monument. Memories, some of them haunting, came racing back. Felix Shemensky of Alpena lunched at the rusting remains of a French 75 and remembered that long, terrifying night when he lay wounded and forgotten with a bullet through his neck.
I was shot through the neck and left on the field as dead. I probably was not dead, but my buddies thought that I was dead.
So what happened then?
So they left me there, and when I was picked up, I do not know. Because that's, you don't know whether it was 5 minutes later or maybe it was 5 days later. You don't know which. 7 days later, I got a doctor.
A month before that night, near death, 19-year-old Sergeant Shemensky had walked into Belleau Woods with 250 others. The next morning, only 78 were alive and not wounded. After lunch, there was a brief stop at this American cemetery of Anne-Marne. Here, Jack Grego learned that his brother was buried in another cemetery, Voisin, only 10 miles away. Jack, who plays tenor drum for the World War I Drum and Bugle Corps, is a Navy veteran of that war. His brother lies with 6,000 other Americans, some of them under crosses reading, "Here rests in honored glory a comrade in arms known but to God." Some soldiers buried near Dominic Grego are well known. 12 rows down and 18 crosses to the left is Joyce Kilmer, the poet who wrote Trees. His creativity was snuffed out when a bullet ripped through his sergeant's uniform. Although the American superintendent of this cemetery said that very few Americans visit here, there were flowers on the monument. They were placed by French people who remember that 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month back in 1918 and what it means to their homeland. They remember and are grateful. Dominic Grego and the other fallen men earned the greatest honor there is, dying for their country, for world peace. Dominic lived for a while in Sault Ste Marie. Then he crossed the ocean and fought in a war not of his own making. Finally, the bullet of fate found Dominic Grego.
We'll salute. 1.
60 years later, in France, an English coach driver of Scottish descent played taps on a harmonica for an American of Italian heritage. Dominic's brother knelt at his grave while the other Sioux vets stood at attention and saluted. Dominic is remembered. And because the people of Sault Ste. Marie asked others everywhere to help send the World War I Drum and Bugle Corps overseas, the people of the United States, England, and France, and the entire free world had a strong, moving reminder of just what it meant those 60 years ago, when the bloody war to end all wars drew to its bittersweet end on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month.
It's called The Years Pass, Comrades Remain. Old years have gone, new years have come, but we still remember World War I. You came to play, to drink and be fed, but mostly to remember your friends who are dead. They died in foreign lands afar. That brings us back to where we are. You guys are proud, and rightly to be. Just a few of the vets from Sault Ste. Marie. Heroes come and heroes go. Where their courage comes from, we'll never know. One group of such men, you'll agree I'm sure, is the World War I Drum and Bugle Corps. I will live my life hoping and praying to be like one of the vets from Sault Ste. Marie.